I am Deanna Kalala. I'm president of the board for the National Organization for Disorders of the Corpus Callosum. And I'm so thrilled to be presenting this presentation that we have tonight to all of you. The NODCC, about a year and a half ago now, right before the last conference, asked all of our members, would you like to support research? And the overwhelming response that we heard back from our members was, yes, please, let's do it now. And so it's really fitting that the NODCC's first big endeavor in supporting research was supporting someone who also has a lot of firsts as well. You guys all probably know Dr. Lynn Paul very well because she was one of the first researchers to invest so much of her time and career into disorders of the corpus callosum. She was also one of the first founders of the NODCC, and this natural history fellowship came out of one of the first longitudinal studies of disorders of the corpus callosum. So great firsts all around, and it's really just an honor to participate in this. One other thing that I want to get out the way at the very beginning is also to thank all of our parents. We had a number of parents and adults with DCC participate in helping bring both this presentation and the series that will come after it to life. And so I just want to say their names really quickly as a thank you. And I'll just say first names since this is going on YouTube, but Kathy, Doreen, Greg, Danielle, Chris, Jennifer, Jothish, Courtney, and Dan. Thank you guys so much for all of the time that you've spent working with Lynn and with Ella to pull this together. And then last but not least, I have to say a huge thank you to Ella, who you're going to hear so much from tonight and over the next few weeks. But Ella has been just a godsend to the organization. Not only is she doing this wonderful natural history fellowship, the first fellowship of its kind for our organization, but she's also helping us behind the scenes with all the nitty gritty board details as well. And so Ella, thank you so much for all of the hard work that you've put into this, and thank you for your investment in our families and our adults with DCC. So, with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lynn Paul to get us started. Thank you guys so much for joining.
Hi, everybody. You'll have to forgive me. I've got quite a cold, and so my voice is pretty sketchy. We'll see how I do. Um, it is my complete and utter delight to be here this evening and to honor the work of the NODCC and kind of launch a new phase of collaboration, is how I view this, between researchers and the families, the patients, the what's the word they call it? The stakeholders is the word in patient-centered outcomes world. So this fellowship is um, was funded by the NODCC for the coming year, and I'm going to give you some background and then introduce you to Ella. So my work started with Dr. Warren Brown. We were focused on adults and understanding the long-term outcomes of agenesis in particular. And that's kind of how you all got to know me, many of you. Um, and then about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, some families came to us, to me and my colleagues at Caltech, and said, we would really like you to study our kids, our babies. And it sparked an idea. And at the time, we had a postdoctoral fellow at Caltech, Jed Elison, who had worked with a huge multi-site autism research study on infant development. So it was perfect timing. Jed and I sat down and I said, I'm not an infant studies person. Fill me in. What do we do? How do we go about this? Um, and so Jed and I designed this study and launched what was the ACC infant study. Now we're calling it DCC to make it more broad. And it is built on the foundational structure of that autism research program. And I'll tell you in a few minutes why that's important. So we started with the infant study. We were able to get it funded by the National Institutes of Health from 2018 to 2023. And then currently, we've kind of kept it going with a little bit of an extension of that, and then a seed grant from the University of Minnesota and from this fellowship. So, under current circumstances, it's increasingly challenging to get funding from NIH. So, we're trying to figure out how we'll go forward. But I want to encourage you by showing you how we've really laid the foundation for the future of research on this condition. So, as we started the infant study, we also started the child study. The infant study was focused on 6 to 36 months, and the child study also started at 6 months and went up to 18 years. But it was for kids that didn't quite fit into the infant study at the beginning. Now, if you want to go on, if you see the materials, if you want to enroll, you can use the QR code at the bottom. These are our most recent flyers, thanks to the parents of these two precious little ones um, for sharing their pictures. We are still doing the infant study, and the things that distinguish it are we have continued to pay participants because we've had some funding behind it. And some of those participants are invited to be tested in person in Minnesota. And that's what makes it unique. You have to start by the first year of life and carry on, and then you get paid by age 3. It ends. If you enroll after 12 months, you will automatically be put in the child study because of the structure of things. But all of the data goes together. So, and for those of you who are members of this study or participants, you'll all recognize Jasmine at the bottom. Jasmine was the pre-Ella who really helped launch this and made this study possible. So moving forward, the the infant and child studies have a couple goals that are one, my primary goal always is to understand the kids with DCC. I work for you. That's where my interest lies. And so you can diagnose this before birth, which means you can track development from birth, which is different than something like autism that can't be diagnosed until 3. So you can't track it from birth because you don't know what it is or who has it. That makes this condition very unique in developmental disorders, and a large percentage of kids with DCC actually develop autism symptoms. So it actually can inform us then about how disorders of the corpus callosum and the corpus callosum may contribute to autism and other behavioral disorders. So we have kind of a dual purpose, a more general scientific purpose there in green, and the one that you guys care about is in blue. Because how many of you got the diagnosis? The first question was, what can I expect? What's going to happen? And people didn't know. So you can move on and just click these so they go. Oh, um, so the scope of this study is to look at the neuroanatomy, the basics of that, health related issues, developmental progression, some causal possibilities, effects, and then mainly, how does this affect behavior? And what is common across kids with the DCC? So what can you expect from a kid with a complete agenesis or partial or whatever? How does that predict what's going to happen at 10, 11, and 12? And right now, there's no data out there. There's lots of stories, and people also all get told all sorts of things like your kid will be fine, it's not a problem, all of those things. But the only way to know is by gathering the information from a lot of different patients, putting it together and looking for the patterns. and doing that in a systematic way. And that's what scientists do. We take a problem and we say, how do we make it systematized and control all the things that we can control so that we know what we're describing is as accurate as possible. Um, the timeline across the bottom is the time points of this whole study. So we do more tightly timed questionnaires with families early on and then annually through age 17. Ella. Um, and getting to the structure issue, as a scientist, I've spent a lot of time working on psychometrics, like how do you set up a study? How do you make it reliable and valid so that you're testing what you think you're testing? So we use some of the standardized, established surveys and tests. And Jed was great at helping us do that because he knows all those infant tests and he knew what was already being used. And Jed had a control group of typically developing kids and kids that were likely to develop autism and kids with these other developmental conditions, Down syndrome. So by working in collaboration with him, we were able to not have to collect control data, which saved us a ton of money and time. And we get to compare to all these other conditions. And it means the impact of this research will be much greater. So that's my message of hope for you is I am, as Gianna recently said, I think around the corner. I think around a few corners. And so this has been built so that we could have enough information that we could really tell a big story for you and for others. So we have the standardized questionnaires, we have interviews, many of you have done those, and then this natural history. And that natural history is our study specific questionnaires, Ella. And the study specific questionnaires are the ones that are focused on what we call natural history. It's um, trying to get a concrete, as comprehensive as possible description of what is, how people are getting diagnosed, when they're getting diagnosed, what tests are being used, when are people's diagnoses changing, what therapies are you getting, who's doing the diagnosing, you know, the whole array of what is. From that, then we can kind of start to recognize patterns and say, oh, well, maybe this is something we should study more in depth. So it guides us toward what we should study more. It highlights things that we may want to do interventions about. And it gives a baseline for all of the families who want to know what to expect and how kids might compare with the typical peers. That's a broad range of topics. So to set this up, thinking around the corner, I contacted Dr. Scher at UCSF and said, tell me what background questionnaires you use. Give me all of the things you use for your study, because he has over 1,000 participants. And then I used his background studies and Jed's from the other projects and created the background studies for what we use at Fuller and for the DCC Child and Infant Studies, which means I just recently merged all of these. Between the three of us, we've tested almost 2,000 people with DCC. There's a surprisingly little overlap between the UCSF group and ours. So all of that data, ultimately, my goal is to be able to merge that. And that means we've standardized our data collection across labs, across age groups. Warren and I at Fuller get adults, these are DC children, and across time. So we started working on these things together 20, almost 25 years ago, and have been working to have a coordinated set of data for the future, for going forward. And so you're going to hear more about that in the coming weeks and months about how you can help support building out this community community supported research center, so to speak. Now, all of that, all this background data. We have all sorts of standardized questionnaires, but we have all this background data. And Ella came along, and she is interested in infant development and had the tenacity to tackle this. And so she started this as a summer undergraduate research fellow, did a couple of those fellowships with me. Now she is the new Jasmine, running this project, managing data collection, and thanks to the NODCC, running this natural history study, which means analyzing the data that we had already collected. So here you go, Ella. Tell us more.
Sorry about that. I was really struggling to get unmuted. Um, all right. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the natural history study today and do a bit of an introduction to it, and give you some preliminary findings. So thank you again so much to Lynn and Deanna for those wonderful introductions. Um, I I'm going to give just a bit of an overview. So, this natural history study is based off of all of that background information, as Lynn mentioned. And our overall goal for this study is to define what is typical for a uh, infant or child with a disorder of the corpus callosum. Um, and yeah, so we have all of this information from almost 500 different participants. Um, and in a bunch of different aspects of development. And we're going to look at the developmental trajectory and see what, again, is sort of typical or a baseline for an individual with a DCC. And another important part of this is that we will be looking at the context of the larger population, the general typically developing population, and sort of comparing that development, as well as identifying uh, sort of spots that need some early intervention or need a little bit more help to help infants and kids with a DCC become their best self. And so just first a little information about me. I know Lynn did a little bit of this, but I started my um, research with DCC a couple of years ago. I did a summer research internship at Caltech with Lynn and Jasmine, and was actually able to go to my first NODCC conference, which is where I became acquainted with the wonderful NODCC community. Um, and I came back for the following summer, and after that became the manager of the DCC Lifespan Studies, which I still do to this day, and am now doing this fellowship. And I'm so thankful to the NODCC for allowing me this opportunity and helping this research continue, because it's so important, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. And I'm excited to present some findings to you all today. So I did a bit of an overview, but I want to do just a little more information about the natural history study. So our main, what we're trying to do in the study is turn anecdotes into evidence. And so the way we're doing that is we're making sure that the measures that we're using and the data that we've collected is measuring what we think we're measuring. And so we're doing this in a way that it'll be able to be used for medical purposes. So we'll write this up and you'll be able to give this information to your medical provider, medical professionals, anyone who can give you that care that you're seeking. And this is also anchored in the larger context of developmental understanding. So we're looking for groups to, or we're looking at, again, the overall general population to see how kids with DCC are doing on the overall scale of development. We're also breaking down our larger sample into different comparison groups. So dysgenesis, agenesis, hypoplasia, these smaller subgroups of our overall sample, to compare and see what these individual diagnoses look like in comparison to each other and what that means for development in a DCC. And lastly, we are also going to be doing a bit of a deep dive on analysis and specifics of research today, and talk about interpretation of results and context of information, because statistics can be deceiving, which I will talk a bit more about in the next slide. So, what do I mean by statistics can be deceiving? So, if you look at this first quote, only 3% of our participants are in a special education program. This might be a bit surprising, but this is just one example of how a statistic can be deceiving because only 30% of our participants are in school. So that really changes the context of that first piece of information. And I bring this up to show how sample differences and the context of information it's important to take context into consideration when you're reading research and when you're looking at research, and when you're doing research. So I wanted to bring that up and have us think about that as we're going through this presentation. Um, one way in which we're making sure to consider the context of this information in our research is by using different types of data and different types of data collection. So two types of data that will be a part of this project are prospective data and retrospective data. So prospective data means that you're answering questions about current behaviors. So if your child is 2 years old, you'll be answering questions about current behaviors, what they're currently doing, what their development currently looks like. And this is likely to be more accurate data as it is currently happening and there's not as much past information to recall. And so it's a bit more accurate. But there's also retrospective data, which we also will be utilizing in the study. And that is when you're answering questions about past events. And this could be any span of time. So your child could be 17 and you'll be answering questions about when they were born. So quite a bit of time in between there, which means there's a higher opportunity for bias, things to get misremembered. But these are both very valuable types of data, and they will both be utilized in our study. But we want to be careful about when we are using which kinds of data, so that we are able to give accurate and good information. And I wanted to put that into context of our infant and child studies. So with our infant study, participants are enrolled between 0 and 14 months. So they're answering our background questions between these ages. And for example, when they're answering questions about birth, it's quite a bit closer to the birth. So it's a bit more fresh in the memory. Whereas with the child study, participants are answering this information providing this information between 2 and 17 years after birth. So in this case, for birth and pregnancy questions, we might tend to use more of the infant study participants or participants that are closer to the original event. So that is one way we'll be using specific parts of the sample in different ways and in different situations. Whereas with the child study, we have questions about schooling. And so a lot of the participants in the infant study aren't school age, so that won't apply to them. So we'll be using the child study for a child study participant information for that section of the study. And so we'll be using both of these types of data in different ways, and with different sections of the sample, to really add context to all of our information. Another topic I wanted to bring up with data analysis and context of information is data validation. And so sometimes self and parent report data, which is what this study is built off of, can have issues with validity. So some ways that we're combating that are medical record confirmation. This is the first one. So when a participant enrolls in our study, we ask them to submit medical records or scans, and we review it and put it into our system. Um, so that is one way that we're validating that information on things like diagnosis and medical information. Another way we're validating our data is having consistent answers or verifying consistent answers. So as Lynn mentioned, we have multiple time points for each participant. So they'll answer questions at 6 months and then 12 months and then 18 months. So we're getting a lot of the same or similar information at all of these time points. And so we can look back and make sure that those answers are consistent over time or that they make sense in a developmental trajectory. And so that is one way that we're also validating our data. And then we also have these phone interviews or the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, which we administer to infant study participants, as many of you, I'm sure, know and have experienced. Um, and this is also prospective data, as I was talking about in a previous slide. So this is confirming developmental information as it is happening. And so that's just one more way to really validate and confirm this information. And yeah, and so our study does have that built-in repetition and validation built into it, which really helps with the confirmation and reliability of our data, which is really important when we are publishing research. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about what we will be producing within this fellowship. So the first will be a series of informational webinars, of which this is the first one. There will be more information on the following ones at the end of this presentation. Next, we'll also be producing an interactive community report. And so what this is, it'll be a data tool that'll be hosted on the NODCC website. And all of our data will be in there from this study and will be put into different configurations to represent different facets of the information. And this will be interactive, which means you can go in and use filters for diagnosis or age, which will be really cool to look at your specific situation if you need to look at someone with complete agenesis that is isolated versus if you need to look at someone who is has dysgenesis of the corpus callosum and is DCC plus. So it'll be a really useful way to look at this information and present it to the community. And lastly, we are going to have this information written up as a research paper and it'll be published. So you're able to bring it to professionals, anything related to that, and be able to show them a published study about the developmental trajectory of DCC. So I keep talking about this data and this information. And so we're going to look at what that looks like. In this study, again, we use this background questionnaire, and I see a lot of you have participated, so you are probably very familiar with these questions. But in this questionnaire, we ask questions about colossal disorder diagnosis, medical history, family background, developmental history, and pregnancy and birth history. And I'll break that down a little bit in the following slides. So with colossal disorder diagnosis, we ask questions about when a participant was born, when a participant was diagnosed. Was it prenatally? Was it postnatally? How were they diagnosed? So what type of scan did they have? What age were they at this scan? And since we do ask this, we have this background questionnaire asked to participants at every time point, we do get medical updates on that. So if diagnosis has changed over time, if there's an additional diagnosis that's added later on, we get all of that information. And I have some sample questions on the side so you can just see what that looks like if you're not familiar with it already. For medical history, we ask about physical health, so things like vision and hearing, any issues with cardiac systems, whether a participant has experienced seizures in the past or present, any medications that a participant is taking or has taken. And we also ask about psychological health, so whether a participant has any neurodevelopmental diagnoses, such as autism spectrum disorder, or any psychiatric diagnoses. For family background, we ask about participants' family medical history, so whether anyone in their family has a history of a disorder of the corpus callosum, or again, any neurodevelopmental disorders. And we also ask about demographic information such as race, ethnicity, education, income, things like that. For pregnancy and birth history, we ask about conception, whether there were any difficulties surrounding conception, any complications during pregnancy, such as illness or physical trauma, whether any medications, prescription medications or substances were used, and whether the parent had any delivery complications or the child had any delivery complications, how long their hospital stay was, things like that. And lastly, we ask questions about developmental history. So when the participant said their first word or took their first steps, as well as how their performances in the school setting, how they do with social interactions, how their sleep is, and any issues with feedings, like things like that. So we ask a lot of information. That is the point of all this. We have so much information. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our enrollment and participation in this study. So since the beginning of the DCC lifespan studies in 2015, we've had 807 participants enroll, which is an amazing number. And as you can see on the graph, in the graph on the left, this is broken down, enrollment by year, broken down by year, sorry. And on the bottom, we have dark blue, which means that a participant has, that's the number of participants that have both enrolled and participated. So given any amount of information towards the study. In the gray section, we have participants that enrolled but didn't give any information or didn't participate at all. And in the blue, similar to the gray, they've enrolled and not participated, but it's been pretty recent, so we're still hoping we can have them participate and give us some information. And this is a summary of that on the right. So in total, we have 493 participants that have completed at least one full background questionnaire, which is so many. And we have 75 participants that have a partial background questionnaire filled out. So varying degrees of how much they filled out, but at least 75 participants have started the background. And this does leave us with 239 participants that have not given any data but have enrolled. And as you can see, participation has been decreasing a bit over time, though enrollment is still pretty high. We would love to have that participation go back up as well. And so in this figure, we have age at first participation. So this is, I'm going to go back one slide a little bit. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on this group of 493 participants with the full background. That will be our sample for the rest of the talk. And so in this graph, this is representing that 493 participants. And this is when they completed their first background questionnaire. And as you can see here, a majority of our participants completed their first background questionnaire before 3 years old, or before 4 years old. And this makes sense, seeing as we have heavily emphasized the infant study, which is 6 to 36 months. So this majority being in that 3-year range does make a lot of sense. And this also is very useful because it can help us feel very confident that that early information like pregnancy and birth history is quite uh, good information because it was so close to the source. Um, so yeah. In this figure, we have age at diagnosis. And so again, this is that for 493 participant group. And again, the majority is very early on. So 62% of our participants were diagnosed prenatally, um, and with the majority of the postnatal diagnoses being before 12 months. Um, and so even though we have participation, quite a bit of participation in the later years, many of those participants were diagnosed quite early on, which is an interesting point, and I will talk about this more in the next couple of slides. So I want to talk a little bit about the big picture of this natural history study. So in blue, we have the overall population of individuals with DCC, and this yellow circle right here is the participants in our sample. So our sample is what we call a convenience sample, which means that we put the word out, and whoever enrolls and is willing and able to participate is a part of our sample. This means that our sample may not be representative of individuals with DCC overall. Um, Ideally, our sample would be randomly selected from the entire population of individuals with DCC, but that is not very realistic for research. And we're very grateful to have our wonderful participants that we work with because we could not be here without them, and we could not do this research without them. So thank you. We do recognize, however, that there are maybe biases in our sample, as our participants do seek us out, so they may be more research oriented, or they may be more concerned with the diagnosis, or more willing to participate in research or have different resources. So we do want to take that into account, but that is just one limitation of our sample. And so we want to put that into the context. We want to put this study in context of that. So we know that while this is a huge sample, this is 493 people, it can always be a larger sample size because the larger the sample, the more likely it is that it will be more representative of the overall group of individuals with DCC. And our aim is to generalize our findings to the overall population of individuals with DCC, but we want to recognize that our sample may not be wholly generalizable. But we are taking those precautions that we talked about before to make sure that our research can be as broadly applicable as possible. So this brings us to our sample. So again, we do have 493 participants, and in our sample, most being white, non-Latino or Hispanic. And while it is more so even in the sex distribution, there are more males than females. One demographic of note is the participants' country of residence. A majority of our sample is from 70% is from the United States, with the next leading countries being Great Britain or the UK, Australia, and Canada. And this is of note because healthcare varies by country, so that means that scan availability might be different country to country, as well as medical consultation and the availability of early interventions, especially early interventions, which is especially important in development for DCC. So we want to take into account the fact that our participants might have had different experiences due to their country of residence. So for information regarding anything country specific, again, such as skin availability or intervention availability, we may be limiting our sample to participants from the United States for those aspects, so we can eliminate confusion. Additionally, we want to give a quick shout out to CorePal and Ostock. I think there are a few of you on the call, and we want to thank you for being here tonight and appreciate all of the work you do. So thank you. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about our preliminary findings. Though I know you're all probably very familiar with disorders of the corpus callosum, I wanted to give just a quick overview about the types and what I'll be referencing in the rest of this presentation. So the first term is dysgenesis, which is an overall umbrella term for the group. This means that the corpus callosum did not develop properly or correctly, and this is also what we use as sort of a overall term if there isn't a specific diagnosis. So that is our dysgenesis group, sort of our catch-all group. Next, we have agenesis, which means that it didn't develop at all or is absent. And then hypoplasia, which means it's full length, and we have some pictures here. So in that first picture, we have a typically developing brain, and the corpus callosum is very apparent as compared to the next photo with complete ACC, where it's very obviously missing. And then in that third photo, we have partial ACC, so there's just a little bit there at the front. And then in the last photo, we have hypoplasia, where, as you can see, it's there, but just very thin. And I also want to talk about some associated neuropathologies. And so these are malformations that are commonly associated and caused by disorders of the corpus callosum. So in this, there we go. First figure, on the left, we have a typically developing brain with a corpus callosum, and on the bottom, we have an individual with absence of the corpus callosum, or agenesis. And we can also see that this little spot here at the front is the anterior commissure, and there are some pictures on the right as well that show the anterior commissure, and this is the other portion of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. And so it's much smaller, so much less information going between it. But that is there. And so we also want to point out the associated neuropathology of colpocephaly and proboscis. And so the proboscis are a result of the lack of formation of the corpus callosum, and they're white matter tracts that form in the middle of the brain due to, again, the lack of a corpus callosum. And then lastly, we have colpocephaly, and we can see in this bottom photo, what this is the ventricles in the back, as you can see the arrows pointing to, will be filled with fluid or be more dilated in the back. And this, again, is a result of ACC. And on the right as well, in this bottom right picture, you can see there's like horns, and this is a hallmark of ACC. And I also wanted to point out that colpocephaly can often be confused in diagnosis with ventriculomegaly, as they both involve dilation of the ventricles, but if they are diagnosed early on, such as prenatal diagnosis, they can often be confused. And so we do group these together in our research. So yeah, I wanted to point that out for going forward. Something else of note is that the consistency of diagnosis over time, a majority of our participants, as discussed before, are diagnosed prenatally. And this and often only rely on prenatal scans for diagnosis, information, and diagnostic purposes. But this can present some limitations. First being that when you're getting scanned prenatally, it is an ultrasound or a fetal MRI, and it can be more of a blurry image or not as clear of an image because babies move and you're also scanning through another person. So this can lead to inexact diagnosis, especially in terms of the ventricles. So again, going back to the colpocephaly and ventriculomegaly, this can result in that confusion between those two diagnoses. And there can be blurring of gray and white matter as it's not as defined early on. And so this can lead to often inexact or not as well developed DCC categorization. Um, and we have some findings that are yet to come about diagnosis over time and consistency of diagnosis over time. So we'll be looking at our sample and seeing how those who have prenatal scans or prenatal diagnosis, how the diagnosis changes over time, if it does, if it's consistent. So we'll come back to you in the future with some more information about that to see if, again, those diagnoses change over time. All right, and going along with this topic, we have the scan rates of our participants. So, as I mentioned before, we ask our participants to submit medical records, images, or reports at the beginning of their enrollment. And so on the left in blue, we have participants that only have a prenatal scan, which represents about 23% of our sample. Whereas on the right in pink, we have participants that only have a postnatal scan, which is about 35%. And in the middle, we have participants that were diagnosed prenatally, but also have a postnatal scan, which is about 42% of our participants. And so I keep emphasizing the sort of limitations of a prenatal scan, but I haven't told you about the benefits of a postnatal scan. So the optimal scan age for both diagnosis and research and personal records is having a scan at 2 years or older. And there are multiple reasons for this. The brain is still developing before 2 years, especially gray and white matter, until about 2 years old, and then it is more stable after that. And not as much will change in the structure, which means that it's an optimal time to get a more permanent or baseline scan and have a better record of what a participant's brain looks like. Additionally, kids are a bit older at 2 than they are in the womb, obviously. And so that scan will likely be a little bit more accurate for movement and yeah, things like that. And for research, it's great for us to have a direct review of the scans by our colleagues to allow for attribution of other characteristics or variations in DCC. And so if we have these more concise diagnoses between our participants, then we can attribute these different characteristics more confidently to different subgroups. It's also really important to have a quality scan for personal records as well to have sort of a baseline scan in case something happens, like a new symptom arises or there's a brain trauma, something like that. An individual can have a baseline scan to see if anything has changed, anything in comparison to, again, that baseline scan, which is really important. So in our study, we do accept medical records as reports or scans, as I mentioned before, but I wanted to talk about the difference between having these. And there are a couple different outcomes. So first, some participants don't submit any medical information at all. And this is difficult for us because we're unable to confirm that diagnosis. And it's also difficult to publish research with that participant in a sample, as journals often require medical record confirmation of diagnoses for participants. So that is a little more difficult. Participants can also submit a report, which is great to have a primary medical source and have that as a confirmation of that diagnosis. But it also does pose limitation in the fact that the radiologist reviewing it, or sorry, the scan quality might not be as great. We're not sure. We haven't seen it. Um, and the radiologist reviewing it may not be as familiar with ACC or DCC, and so it might be a little bit more difficult to diagnose, things like that. And our last scenario, which is our ideal scenario, is that participants submit brain images or scans. And this is great for us because we have neuroradiologists that we work with that are that are experts in the field of research with DCC and ACC. So they're very familiar with these diagnoses and these scans. And so we have consistent categorization from them in a DCC diagnosis, as well as additional neuropathologies. And it's coming from the same team. So we have consistency between those diagnoses, which is um, really great for research and categorization purposes. So again, our ideal situation is having those scan images, but overall, it's really important to have any medical record confirmation of diagnosis from participants in general. And here we have some diagnosis information from our sample. So again, this is the group of 493 participants. And as you can see here, this pie chart in the top left corner, we majority of our participants do have complete ACC, and then a pretty even split between partial ACC, hypoplasia, and dysgenesis. And on the right, we have a graph depicting additional neuropathologies broken down by that DCC diagnosis. And so we do have three groups in this graph as well. The first being none, which is in blue, dark blue. And this is when a participant has only ACC or only DCC and no other neuropathologies or brain malformations. And then our next group is the common group, or sometimes we call it our isolated group. And this can also, isolated can also refer to no malformations or common malformations. And the common malformations are things like colpocephaly, ventriculomegaly, any interhemispheric cysts or lipomas, absence of the septum pellucidum, and arachnoid cysts. And then lastly, we have our last group, which is the atypical group, or sometimes the plus group, so DCC plus. And these are our participants that have more atypical malformations, so things that may be associated with DCC, but also can present more severe symptoms or may be causing other things that can be a bit more confusing for the categorization or the defining the typicality of DCC. And so these would be things like heterotopia, microcephaly, polymicrogyria, any pituitary malformations, cerebellar malformations, genetic abnormalities, or cerebrovascular incidents. And as you can see here, we have all of the same information, but only with our participants that have a verified diagnosis. And so what we say, or what we consider a verified diagnosis, is having a submitted medical record, as well as having that record be of a postnatal scan, so the most quality scan we can have. And this leaves our group with only 256 participants. And so all of the gray in these three figures here, those are all of the participants that have not submitted that quality record. And this, again, cuts our sample down quite a bit, but we still have a similar distribution in diagnosis. So a majority complete ACC, and then a pretty even breakdown between partial ACC, hypoplasia, and dysgenesis. And then on the right, we have, again, mostly uncertain, but a pretty similar breakdown as before. As we can see, a majority of our sample is still isolated, complete ACC. Um, and this slide, I just have a breakdown of the common neuropathologies. So again, these are diagnoses that are commonly associated with corpus callosum dysgenesis and don't contribute more additional severe symptoms. And a little over half of our sample does have colpocephaly or ventriculomegaly. Less than a third has an absent septum pellucidum, and then lower percentages of hydrocephalus and interhemispheric cysts and lipomas, arachnoid cysts, and Chiari malformation type 1. And I have a similar figure, but for our atypical group or our plus group. And again, these are diagnoses that may have more severe symptoms than a DCC, but these all have a much lower percentage within the population of our sample. Um, and I don't have in these individually broke down. I have quite a bit in the other category, but it's important to note here that we do have over 25% of our sample with an atypical neuropathology. And so, just for some overall takeaways about our natural history study, is that natural history studies are the foundation of building research for rare and developmental disorders. This is a way that researchers can identify what this disorder looks like in development, looks like, define sort of a baseline or a typicality of a rare or developmental disorder. And this is what we're doing for DCC. By the end of this study, we will be able to identify that what is typical for DCC. And we also want to emphasize that the lived experience of our participants is so important, and that's why we're taking that information and turning it into this study driven by evidence and driven by our participants. And it'll be used to inform future individuals and families and medical professionals with evidence of what development looks like in a DCC. And some takeaways from our findings so far is that a majority of our participants are diagnosed before 12 months, which may be a little bit of bias from our infant study. And so in the future, increasing the sample to include adults with retrospective data and increasing numbers in the child study will be helpful to get a more well-rounded picture of DCC development. And also, the majority of our sample has isolated complete DCC and isolated complete ACC. And this is representative of this sample, and growing our sample in the future will be exciting because we'll be able to see if that is true of a larger and larger group of individuals with DCC and is more representative of the overall population. And also some takeaways about participating in research is that participation of all or most individuals is ideal if you're able to at all ability and developmental levels, no matter if you're an individual with more delayed development or if there is little to no evidence of external evidence of a DCC, we want you to participate for all time points or as many as possible. I know you all have very busy lives and we're very appreciative of your participation in any capacity. And with all details and all records, so quality records, quality details. And yeah, it's important to work as researchers with parents because you all know so much about your kids and you know so much about yourselves, and that's how we generate knowledge about DCC is working together and using this information to contribute to this overall knowledge about this disorder. And so, just to point out some upcoming activities within the fellowship, as mentioned before, there will be three additional webinars, one in March, one in April, and one in May. And I'll pause here for a second. So if you want to take a picture of that, that is up there for you with all of that information. And again, that interactive community report, which there will be more information about this soon, and a published research paper. And huge thank you to Lynn and Jasmine and everyone at the University of Minnesota. And thank you so much to the NODCC. We could not have done this without you, and we're so grateful for all of your help. And an extra special thank you to everyone who has participated in this research program. We really could not have done this without you. We're here because of you, and we're so thankful. And I have two QR codes. So if you're not enrolled already, please enroll. And if you're not sure if you have, please send me an email and I'll let you know. And yeah.
It's on mute. Awesome. Thank you so much, Ella. I think you can all definitely tell that we've got a deep bench investigating disorders of the corpus callosum, and there's a lot of research and participation out there. I thank you all so much for participating in this call. And if you participated in this call, you are very well prepared to really learn and understand the context for the next three series seminars that we have coming up. So we do encourage you to come back, check your emails. We will send more details about it. But I just want to share a huge thank you to Dr. Lynn Paul and to Ella Bohlman for their time and participation on this. I know it's after our 9 o'clock stopping time, so no worries if you have to drop off now. But thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
I Can I add a comment or two if for
Oh,
anybody who
sure.
wants to stay? I was just looking at the questions. Um, the septum pellucidum, the leaves of the septum pellucidum are a part of the process of forming the corpus callosum. So it's gonna it is often missing in this condition, and it's not a separate issue, so to speak. Like it's just evidence that you have a corpus callosum malformation. So for those of you who are wondering about the frequency of identifying it, I think it may not be identified in a lot of the reports because it's taken as a given. Um, so we won't make a big deal of that, but thank you for your concern on it. Um,
And there was
but
one more question.
it also goes to the importance of us actually getting to see the scan and the consistency. And so one of the things that we're also trying to do is develop a standardized approach for radiologists to use because there are not standardized criteria for reporting on this condition. So out of this, hopefully we will be able to do that. Um, and I also wanted to say, if somebody questioned about coming back to Minnesota, we had we had solid hopes of getting a renewal of our grant. So you get 5 years and you can renew it for another five, and we would have an extended process. And after a few rounds of applications, we have not been able to secure that funding. So at the moment, there isn't, we don't have the resources to bring people back for the 5-year-old evaluation. But and that is, of course, our dream and our hope.
And there was one more question too about whether or not people needed to submit later scans after that initial scan.
Um, if you have an MRI that you got later on, that is very helpful. Yeah. Um, especially if it's after age 2. It's when we talk about change in diagnosis, it's not that anything necessarily changed in the kid's brain. It's that because of the quality of the MRI or who read it or all of these various and sundry things, you may get a different reading. And so one of my questions has been, how's the accuracy of these prenatal diagnoses? How many people are getting a prenatal diagnosis that doesn't turn out to be that? How many of these people that appear to have isolated ACC at age 4 or 5, 2, 3, or 4, now you've got enough detail in the scan that you can recognize that there's actually some other stuff there that wasn't picked up prenatally. So, and that's why later scans are helpful. And thank you. Thank you to the NODCC and everybody who's participated. I love seeing all your comments.